We're happy today to welcome to Arabic Hour Professor Ghada Talhami. She is an expert on the Middle East and has published many books. We would like to start today, Professor Talhami, with the issue of the Iranian nuclear agreement and Israeli resistance to it. And before you get into that, I think it's important for our audience to know that this agreement is just a foundation for the actual agreement, which is supposed to be developed in full in June. And some controversies have already arisen about interpretation of it. Nonetheless, it is a very important landmark foundational agreement. And could you tell us about this agreement and why the Israelis are resisting it so much and using the media and other channels to resist it?
Well, I think it was a long time coming. I think people were always regretful that United States maintained such a hostile attitude towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. After all, the United States invasion of Iraq and changes in the region have all demonstrated how important Iran is to the region. And Iran, whether we like it or not, plays a large role in Iraq, has an impact on Turkey, and I think has a natural impact on the Persian Gulf as one of the major and largest states in the area. So I think it's going to go down in history as one of President Obama's great achievements once he carries it through. And Israeli resistance has been not only surprising, it has been really obnoxious. I mean, this is a country, Israel, which introduced the nuclear age in the Middle East.
That's correct.
It's the Israelis themselves who introduced the nuclear age to the Middle East. They were the ones who acquired nuclear weapons as of 1969. So now for them to say they are threatened by the Iranian possession of nuclear capability, not necessarily nuclear weapons, I think really is disingenuous. And what is even more disturbing is the way in which the media in this country continues to give Prime Minister Netanyahu prime time to express his views as if he is a legitimate member of the United States government. I think this is incredible. We have never seen anything exercised by any ally of the United States. I don't see the French or the British, our closest allies here, adopting this kind of a position and openly opposing the United States policy in this manner. So it's really shocking. What is even more disturbing, I think, is the emergence of a consensus between Israel and Saudi Arabia over the role of Iran in the region. I think it behooves the Saudis to remember that in the end, they will have to deal with Iran. Iran is their neighbor on the eastern side of the Persian Gulf. And so this business of opposing everything Iran doing as if it's the new Satan in the Middle East literally plays in Israel's hand and puts the two, Israel and Saudi Arabia, in the same camp. This is extremely disturbing and novel in the history of the Middle East.
It is,
and I might add, it will have really serious repercussions.
It is indeed, and I think, since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution and the Egyptian peace treaty and other factors, the invasion of Afghanistan, this changed the whole complex in the Middle East, and new alliances formed and others changed. And hence Iran, which was once considered a friendly ally of Israel and the U.S., has been then considered a kind of quote-unquote enemy. So I think Obama and the European nations plus Germany have gone ahead and I think made a really historic thing. Let's talk a little bit more about why Israel is so resistant to this. They claim, of course, they're concerned, it's existential, but is it really that? Because what happens if Iran actually concludes this agreement in June with the U.S. and the European nations, then it really changes the status of Israel in the Middle East, and it stabilizes the area a little bit more in terms of cooperation with Iran. And this, of course, takes away a role from Israel. Would you like to discuss this a little bit further?
I agree totally, Elaine. I think Israel is fearful of the erosion of what it sees and what it has defined over the years as its strategic value to the United States. The United States is trying very hard to put its house in order in the Middle East. And seeking a military confrontation with Iran will not do it. Opening a military front against Iran will be detrimental to United States interests in a very serious manner. I think what the American public does not see or does not want to understand and accept is that Israeli role in the Middle East has become redundant. It has become redundant once the United States has put its own troops in the Persian Gulf area. Okay? So at the end of the Cold War by 1990, yes, with the invasion of Kuwait and so on and so on. So no more can Israel say, we are your strategic allies and we'll go to war for you. Actually, the very prospect of Israel going to war against the old Soviet Union was always problematic. And really, it was mere hype. And I want to add another thing. If you follow carefully President Obama's latest press releases and press interviews, I think he is careful to say that we are now quite interested in confronting the rise of China and really facing the Pacific Ocean. And that, in a way, explains somehow the United States strategy in the Middle East. That is, no more wars. If they can achieve things diplomatically, that is better for the U.S., because the U.S. will have to face the rise of China economically and militarily in the Pacific region. That is really what Obama is saying, and that is what Mr. Netanyahu is not hearing. And so if Israel is truly an ally, it can fight as long as it wants, but it has to accept the erosion of its role during the Cold War. After all, even Britain, which always considered itself the United States' greatest ally, has accepted a reduction in status during the end of the Cold War. So, the world changes, and the rhetoric of the Israeli right doesn't change, and it really has to change now.
There seems to be also another factor that bothers Mr. Netanyahu, and we should point out that Israel never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran did sign. But that other point seems to be that if Iran signs on and the U.S. begins to open trade and they exchange embassies and Europe gets involved and there is some agreement on how to solve the Syrian problem, etc., there will be pressure put on Israel from all these sources to solve to resolve the Palestinian problem, and this factor becomes a very real concern for the Israelis. So all this talk about Iran being a threat to Israel is true only in the sense that it threatens its status and may force it to face up to the Palestinian issue. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, I think if Mr. Obama has enough time left in his current administration, I think he probably would turn full attention to the Arab-Israeli issue, to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Although it has been said, really, that this is a dangerous area for any American president. No American president really gains by involving himself, that's the theory, by involving himself personally in the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. But, hands down, everybody recognizes that this is the oldest and the most unsolvable issue in the Middle East and needs to be tackled sooner or later. But I want to add that the pressure on Israel itself, as you have mentioned, either to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty or to declare its atomic weapons. They have never even admitted that they have nuclear weapons, which of course the world knows. Some Israelis refer to it as the bomb in the basement. In other words, we know it's there, but we don't really talk about it. We don't really declare it. Once Israel accepts that position, then I think we can move a step forward. And I want to mention that I'm also disturbed by the Arab League of States in a way overlooking this issue. Because when Amr Moussa, the former Egyptian foreign minister, was head of the Arab League, he actually went very far in trying to pressure the international community to pressure Israel into signing the NPT treaty. And his argument was Egypt, the largest power, military power in the Middle East, has already settled its situation with Israel by signing the Camp David agreement. So why can't Israel now simply declare its nuclear weapons and move on? And that, of course, went nowhere. So I think it's a real hard nut to crack by the United States. And I'm very pessimistic, by the way, because I think Obama is running out of time. Even though we all know that when an American president becomes a lame duck president, this is really the greatest opportune time for him to tackle the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Well, we'll certainly see what he has in mind if they get this agreement through and if the Republicans cooperate and Congress doesn't try to change it. There seems to be some compromise with Congress. We'll revisit this at some point later because it's the most important issue right now in the Middle East and can change its whole complexion. But let me go on and ask you about Yemen, and let me introduce it by saying that many observers have pointed out that the Saudi bombardment of Yemen was most likely also caused by a kind of Israeli agreement and concern that there was going to be an agreement on the Iran nuclear thing. So that bombardment started to try to prove that the Houthis or the Shiites are a force to be reckoned with, and Iran theoretically is supporting them, certainly not in the ways that the Saudis portray it. But this seems to have been an attempt, at least in part, by the Israelis and the Saudis to jeopardize the Iranian nuclear agreement, and at the cost of what is happening to the Yemeni people. Can you go on and tell us a little bit about what's happening in Yemen and who are the major actors in this situation? Thank you.
Well, first, I will have to add that the Netanyahu government, we assume, must have played a role in encouraging the Saudis in undertaking this military operation, simply to exaggerate Iran's influence in the region. Because to all accounts, as far as we know, Iran's involvement in Yemen has really been minimal. I don't think it has really gotten to the point of major military assistance to the Houthis. It looks like a humanitarian assistance to the Houthis. I don't think the Iranians are anxious to extend themselves that far from their territory and from their area.
No, and they did offer a peace proposal to resolve this, and they
I mean, sane heads are saying let's resolve this issue around the negotiating table, and the Saudis are resisting. This is a third week of bombardment, which has actually penalized no more than civilians. That's what happens when you bombard from the air. You don't really target, or you don't really succeed in hitting military targets. You really punish civilians. Israelis have tried it in Gaza for years, and it really never worked. It simply piled up the number of civilian casualties. This is how sad this whole situation is. But the players are well known. First of all, let's admit Yemen is becoming a failed state, one more failed state compared to or comparable to Somalia across the Red Sea. We have the Houthis, who are legitimate players because they are the original Shia population of the northern part of the country. And of course, they were the allies of President Saleh in the past. And then we have the Al-Qaeda, which apparently operates in southern parts of Yemen. And Al-Qaeda, and this is very ironic, is gaining grounds because of these Saudi attacks, because of the confusion and the disruption of life in Yemen. Precisely as al-Nusra in Syria, which is also affiliated with Al-Qaeda, is gaining grounds because of the Syrian chaos. So, I don't understand how United States allows all this to happen, except to say this is really a foreign policy that is really based on short-term strategy. It lacks very much long-term vision. So the long-term vision should be exactly as you said, Elaine, putting the Yemeni house in order, getting everybody around the negotiating table. But the Saudi role has been unbelievable. It's been really a shocking role. First of all, this is the first time we see Saudi Arabia involved directly, militarily, in the affairs of
they're using American planes and with the blessing of the U.S. on this.
Well, it has tried to assemble a circle of allies, but I think it's doing the major work of attacks from the air. This is new for Saudi Arabia, and my point is, this is a fellow Arab state, and when you invade it, you really should be condemned by, first of all, the Arab League of States. We have done that to Iraq when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. We said to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you cannot invade a fellow Arab state. It's a member of the Arab League of States. I mean, this is as simple as that. In other words, the involvement of the Arab League of States should precede any involvement by the United Nations. And we have now seen a demonstration of how submissive the Arab League of States has become, how useless it has become, literally under the thumb of the Saudis, unable or unwilling to mount any kind of pressure to say to the Saudis, you can't do this. This is a member Arab state.
Yeah, this is correct, because the Arab League Charter says you cannot, that maybe the lines that were drawn, the borders that were drawn were unacceptable from the colonial powers, but they're there and you cannot invade another Arab state. And indeed, they complained a lot when Iraq went into Kuwait, and as you say, that not a peep out of them this time. Tell us a little bit about the President Hadi, who was put in more or less with American and Saudi blessings after Saleh was, in a sense, pushed out. And what is the role of Hadi, who is now in Saudi Arabia, and Saleh, who's still around and is working with the Houthis? He has a lot of know-how about the tribal situations in Yemen, and that's what allowed him to rule in the past, whereas the Saudis have tried to disrupt the tribal situation for a long time.
Well, Hadi should have attempted some kind of inclusion with the Houthis and bringing them into the government, and there was a possibility of doing that at the beginning. Then either by encouragement from Saudi Arabia or by encouragement from United States intelligence circles, he backed down and he tried to resist any inclusion of the Houthis in government. Now, you cannot exclude them, by the way, because they control a lot of territory in northern Yemen. I mean, these are the Zaydi Shi'is that have always controlled northern Yemen. You cannot exclude them. There's no way. And then when former President Mohammed Ali Saleh moved to their side, they gained also more power. But you can see quickly how Saudi Arabia now is saying, we are threatened by the survival, the mere survival of the Houthis in northern Saudi Arabia. It's quite dangerous, and what's really disturbing is this kind of muscle flexing that Saudi Arabia is engaged in. What is even more engaging is its ability to create a coalition of the willing, so to speak, which are all in Saudi Arabia's pay, and except, of course, for the courageous stand taken by the Pakistani parliament, which simply said to its own president, we have no direct interest in intervening in this kind of a battle, so we're going to stay behind. I think even Egypt intervened reluctantly by sending some of its naval units down to the Red Sea and to the Straits of the Red Sea. the whole absurdity, I think, of the Egyptian naval units going down the Red Sea saying we have to protect the Suez Canal, we have to protect free passage through this vital seaway. The whole absurdity of it is that there is something called AFRICOM, which is an American military presence specifically for Africa in Djibouti, former French Somaliland, right across from Yemen. And there are also French units in Djibouti. So at any point, if actually, as the West is claiming, Yemen itself will go under the control of al-Qaeda or Iran or anybody, there are enough military equipment and people in Djibouti to take care of this. So there's really no need for Egypt. Yeah. So Egypt made itself look very ridiculous, really, and cannot justify what it's doing.
Well, you're quite right on that. But tell us, before this bombardment began, the Houthis had made some gain. They wanted to be included in power sharing in the government, and they were never considered as people that could be included in power sharing. So they made, and they had come to a point, made this effort, and then they were bombarded, and now they're on the move again. So tell us what you know about the Houthis having made this effort, but the Saudis going ahead and bombing anyway.
Well, they're unfortunate enough to be among the Shia fringe of Saudi Arabia. So not only Saudi Arabia has this small, they're not really major, this small Shia pocket to their south, but also they have native Saudi Shias, we believe close to 1 million, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Of course, they lived there for centuries at peace with Saudi Arabia. And now Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden, I think within the last few years, has come to the conclusion that it cannot coexist, literally, with any Shias around its territory or within its territory. Notice, I think you agree with me, Elaine, we don't take this business of Shia Sunni too seriously. You know, I'm a Muslim myself, I'm a Sunni Muslim. In my family, my younger sister married a Shia Iraqi. We never even thought of Shias being so different. This is merely the new lingo of the new fault lines of the Middle East, which fit Saudi Arabia as the remaining pro-Western power versus Iran, which is trying to be more and more independent. So, you know, it's very disturbing, and I think it's does not do any service to our religion to provoke or talk about these divisions of Sunni, Shia. It's really Saudi Arabia being insecure about its borders, trying to use a moment in time when it can really bring on American pressure on their side to fight the Houthis. It's, by the way, it's been declared now very clearly that the Saudis could not have mounted this air campaign without assistance from American intelligence services. The American intelligence has been sending drones over Yemen for a long, long time. So they couldn't have done it without the United States. Now they cannot have done it actually by the use of military forces because they don't have much of a military force themselves. So perhaps they are hoping Egypt or Pakistan would play that role. And my fear, and I think I consider myself a student of Egyptian politics, is that the Saudis have historically viewed Egypt as a potential reservoir of military assistance in case they need Egypt. That's why the economic relationship between them and between Egypt has always been strong. But I think the Egyptians will surprise them now because I don't believe the Egyptian public will go on or will go along with the idea of using Egyptian troops on the ground. So the Egyptians may simply make a gesture to assist the Saudis, but I doubt very much it will go beyond that.
Mm. I think you're right on that, Professor. Can you just briefly comment on the fact that ISIS was reported to also have participated in the Yemeni situation? Do you have information on that?
No, I really don't, but I think it's very clear that there are ISIS components in Yemen. when you consider that Yemen has not been really under a functioning government for quite a while now, these pockets of dangerous people, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, are obviously operating over there. And ISIS now seeks any kind of target of opportunity in order to get in a certain area. But I don't think they will proceed very far. I think what you will see down the line is a breakdown in the ISIS-Saudi alliance. And I think you're beginning to see it, because they will not remain on the same page, in the same corner for a long time. Even Saudi Arabia's assistance to al-Nusra has wavered over the last year, off and on. And I don't think the Saudis will be able to really do something about ISIS and continue to be in United States camp. All I know, and I think everybody should know, is that according to some reports in the British press, the Saudis told John Kerry within the last few months during a conference in Europe, you went through with the Iranian talks with Iran, and we gave you ISIS. There was clear admission that we are backing ISIS because now you are trying to resolve your issues with Iran. It's a very intricate issue, but I think maybe in the long run, Saudis have actually bit more than they can chew. I really think this will be too much for them in the long run.
I think that that's beginning to show at this point, although they have always thought of ISIS as a counter to Iranian quote-unquote influence, and they didn't like U.S. pressure and this nuclear agreement. Let me just note the irony of something here, and that is way back, I believe, in 1968, Iran and Saudi Arabia actually cooperated in forming the Muslim Congress, and they formed it as a way of checkmating Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism, because they always felt that they would still have their nationalisms and they could talk about a Muslim concept and it would appeal to people. And now, of course, that has disappeared because the Saudis and others have tried to turn this into a Shiite-Sunni thing, and we tend to use those words, but in fact it became really a concept of who is the strongest power and has the most influence in that area. So let us now go on to Yarmouk in Syria. It was a Palestinian camp, actually more like a residence, and a lot of Syrians actually lived in the camp. And it is now so devastated and so left alone to fend for itself. Tell us give us a little history of the situation in Yarmouk and what is happening there now.
I used to visit Yarmouk with my late husband when I was a Fulbright in Syria in 1997. And yes, it's really quite an interesting community. It's, as you know very well, it's a suburb of Damascus.
Yes.
So it's really not a refugee camp. It's a town on its own. And when the Palestinians now are saying to Assad, hoping for him to hear, that this is really what they call it, the side of Damascus. We are not too far from you. And so if Yarmouk falls, Damascus itself is jeopardized, and the Syrians don't seem to be quite appreciative of this. But what I think has been demonstrated in the last few weeks, which is really regretful, is that the Palestinian different commands have been unable to come together to save the civilian population of Yarmouk. The only people who have been actively trying to send some relief to the Palestinians there are really United Nations agencies, UNRWA in particular. Here is what is really happening. The battles in Yarmouk, which have been fought street by street with al-Nusra and ISIS, which apparently came together only recently in that particular part of southern Syria. The only people who have been fighting are the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, Ahmed Jibril's faction. And Ahmed Jibril's faction, of course, has always been on the outs with the traditional centrist PLO leadership for years. But his base has always been al-Yarmouk, because Yarmouk, as you know, has itself different sections belonging to different cadres of Palestinians. And I have seen an interview on Arabic satellites recently by Jibril, in which he complained bitterly at the fact that Hamas has abandoned Yarmouk. This is also quite sad, because apparently Khalid Mish'al, who used to be Hamas's representative in Syria, was well situated in Yarmouk and was a guest of the Syrian government, the Assad government, which protected him for years, actually protected him genuinely for years. When the civil war started in Syria, he abandoned the Syrians and he chose to move to Qatar. And now he resides in Qatar. And Jibril was really complaining. Now, I don't mean to defend Jibril's politics because I think they're really too radical. But I think he was complaining that there is not a single penny coming out of Qatar and Khalid Mish'al in order to help stiffen up the resistance to ISIS and al-Nusra. In other words, Yarmouk is becoming a warring camp. It's becoming a platform for the latest fights between primarily Hamas on one side and the Arab Palestinian factions. And we are seeing that the Palestine National Authority in Ramallah has washed its hands off of the situation, saying they can't do anything about it. It's going really to take, I think, funding, massive funding, and something about cleaning up those streets and taking the area under its own control. But apparently, we're losing civilians who are being victimized perhaps for the 10th time, not for the first time.
And I understand that the PA made one little effort, and that was to request from Israel that that the people from Yarmouk be allowed to come to the West Bank. And the Israelis said, yes, if they renounce the right of return. As you know, this is a major issue for the Israelis. They want the right of return erased from the books, and of course the Palestinians said no. And basically the Palestinian Authority has abandoned Yarmouk. There are only reportedly 18,000 residents out of 160,000 that are left in Yarmouk, and they have the regime on the outside, and they have Nusra and ISIS, although ISIS has reportedly left the area now, on the inside, and the various Palestinian resistance groups. So do we have any clear picture of what is actually happening? Because there's such a humanitarian problem there. Are the Palestinians able to mount any resistance? Are they getting any help from the Syrians?
I doubt that very much. I think pretty soon we will see the Syrians give up on southern Syria. I think Nusra is already in control of Dir'a, almost near the Jordanian border. Actually, the Syrian-Jordanian border has closed completely. Syrians can only use their air power in that particular region, but as you know, they are involved still in Aleppo and in several parts of Syria, and I'm not so sure that they even place much strategic value on the defense of Yarmouk. But as to the Israelis, let me add something, Elaine, to what you have said. No matter how much Palestinians suffer in different camps as refugees, I think in the end it will reflect badly on Israel itself, because that's a demonstration, a public demonstration on their worldview of what happened to the Palestinian community as a result of the creation of Israel. So the Israelis may be smug about all this, but in the end it delegitimizes the Israelis. It delegitimizes their very presence, because the whole creation of the State of Israel was really made on the backs of those poor refugees that are being penalized over and over and over again. They're simply victims of destabilizing conditions because they were pushed out of their own country. As simple as that.
You're quite right. I mean, the refugees are really the core issue of the Palestinian question. If you solve the refugee problem in terms of their right of return, you can solve other factors as well. But the Israelis are adamant that there will be no return, and hence intensifies the problem. Let us go on to the topic of the Israeli elections. Netanyahu, who had the audacity to come to the American Congress and criticize our president and the upcoming agreement with Iran. People thought that maybe he wouldn't get elected, and they thought that was a ploy to make him look tough. And then he went further and said there'll never be a Palestinian state. And we knew that from years ago in 1978, when his name was then Ben Nettai, and he was working in Boston, and he was on public broadcasting television on a program called The Advocates. He said there's no need for a Palestinian state. There will never be a Palestinian state. So it is not, at the age of 28, he was saying that. He's still saying it. And then he tries to take it back because the U.S. has a position, even though it's rather wishy-washy. So tell us about these elections and what are the consequences of these elections?
Well, I think the consequences are clear. The status quo is on the side of Israel, and Israel knows it. And Israel knows very clearly that it has the Congress on its side, and it knows also very well, and I read this by Israeli authors from various positions, they're all saying the same. As long as Israel escapes sanctions by the US or by the UN, it really doesn't care. It doesn't care about any criticism from Obama, any attack by the administration, as long as it's all verbal. What really would scare them is the imposition of sanctions, as the United Nations has done against South Africa for a number of years, as they have slapped on Iran, as they have subjected Iraq to 10 years of sanctions, which really hurt civilians more than Saddam Hussein. If the Israelis, as long as the Israelis can escape sanctions, they will do precisely what they want to do. I don't think the American public should have been surprised at Netanyahu's rhetoric. I think the American public should have recognized a long time ago that once Israel has been declared a Jewish state, that there will be no hope of creating a Palestinian state. Anyhow, this business of creating a Jewish state, in other words, a denial of the possibility of having a state of all of its citizens. Okay, and this has terrible impact on the Arab community in Israel. As long as Israel gets away with this, then I think there is no hope for this part of the world. I mean, the United States even saw a clear demonstration of the racism of Netanyahu when he kept complaining the Arabs are going in droves to vote. Well, of course they will have to go to vote. It's their right to go to vote. And he simply waved this kind of language and achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve, which is a sort of a solidification of all of the Israeli right behind his back. I think what the elections also demonstrate, and I wish my Israeli friends would be listening to this, is the utter weakness of the Israeli left, the utter weakness of the Israeli peace camp, that we used to sort of place some faith into them. We used to say maybe they can plug some sense into any kind of extremist Israeli cabinet. But apparently they really don't have the power or the will or the interest in moving this country further towards the international community. I mean, all you're hearing now from Europeans, who of course are also on the sidelines, because the European community will never take any serious step in the United Nations without United States support. What you're hearing from the Europeans is that too bad, Israel now is extremely isolated. Well, I don't think they care. I don't think the Israelis really care about being isolated. And I don't think this is true, by the way, because you and I have just said that they're not isolated in the Middle East. Indeed, they are tacit allies of Saudi Arabia and some of the Persian Gulf states in this part of the world. So
Yes.
they're not really that isolated.
Yeah.
So this is only rhetoric, no more. So I think we're all lost in the Israeli elections. I know some Palestinian commentators have said, well, you know, it's good because at least we got to see the real true face of Israel. But I think we lost because Netanyahu now has been assured and reassured. And I think even the mainstream Israeli public have been reassured that United States will never do anything effective to stop them. They will continue to create settlements. They will continue to Judaize Jerusalem. They will continue to say no to the right of return. And I don't think they're going to move anyway.
It's interesting that after the agreement was signed with Iran, that Netanyahu was not only angry, but Obama, who had been sort of ignoring him, began to be a bit more, let's say, personal with him and keeping him informed of everything and so forth. Nonetheless, I think that Obama has encouraged the Europeans to go for the two-state solution, and all this recognition of the Palestinian state, and you know, sort of congratulating the PA, has it looks like a salvage job. Let me put it this way. It looks like Obama is counting on the Europeans to salvage the two-state solution, which the world really has recognized is gone. And so you have that force going on. You have the nuclear agreement happening, which if it goes through in June and stabilizes the area, might create some pressure on Israel. But I remember, and I would like you to comment on this, something that Schultz, Secretary of State Schultz, once said in the 1980s at an AIPAC meeting. He said, and Thomas Dine was then the head of AIPAC, he said, if anyone or any future Secretary of State tries to change American policy towards Israel, they won't be able to, because we have, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing his words, structured Israel and those who support it into the American structure. And in fact, whether it's AIPAC or whether it's ADL or any others, the lobby has insinuated itself into various institutions in American society. And so even with pressure on Israel, it's very difficult without some really chaotic years happening and all kinds of accusations of anti-Semitism and so forth if pressure comes through. So I think we're in for a terrible time in the immediate future. Your thoughts on this as we close out the program?
Well, we've always said that Israel will only implode from the inside, not from the outside. I think when tensions within Israeli society rise, as we think they will rise, because, you know, Netanyahu represents the far right economically as well as politically. And when there are racial tensions with their Ethiopian refugees, with their Palestinian citizens, there will be problems within that particular state. So that's always a possibility. The other possibility, of course, is when the area around them will become more and more hostile. Let's not forget the impact of Hezbollah in Lebanon on checking Israel's ambitions in Lebanon. The war that Israel waged in 2006 against Hezbollah, I think, has really meant a great defeat for the Israelis in the long run, because here they were really defeated by a guerrilla force, which wasn't even in control of the entire Lebanese government. So the situation around Israel eventually will change, probably to their detriment. I don't think they can count on another century or half a century of peaceful situation along their border. No matter how secure they think they are, no matter how the situation deteriorates in the neighboring Arab countries. This is always a fact. The third factor we have to admit is the change in the allegiance of young American Jews who are beginning to make their views and sentiments quite clear, that they do not approve of the use of absolute military power to funnel a civilian population in Gaza and in the West Bank over the years. I mean, these are the people who split from AIPAC. Some of them are rabbis that I know in the Chicago area who stood up against their own congregations to say no to the campaign against Gaza. These are young Israelis full of idealism who truly believe the only possible avenue for Israel to succeed is to become a one-state solution, a state for all of its citizens. And I think that's what many of us really believe in, because this business of an independent Palestinian state is not going to work out. There will be very little territory left by the time the United Nations approves of an independent Palestinian state.
Yes, I think most people have come to that conclusion, though the U.S. still holds that position of two states. We're going to close our interview now, but before we go, not only do I want to thank you for your informed analyses, but I want to ask you if you have anything you would like to say to our audience as we close out this program.
Thank you, Elaine. I enjoyed this program very much. I just want to say that the American public must be very vigilant in tracking down the changes in the Israeli-American relationship, as I feel it is really based on shared intelligence more than anything else. But also people should be reminded that this intelligence that the Israelis manipulate could also be acquired legally elsewhere. The only other thing I would like to add is that it is high time for the American media to play a fair game in this issue. I think we are still hoping and waiting for a real independent American media that can inform and report on the situation in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much. And I might say that the recent fiasco of Richard Engels at NBC, where he reported he was taken by pro-Assad people, actually turned out that he was taken by the Free Syrian Army, the pro-American group, and that somehow he either was tricked into lying or he lied, but it was a false report, which he has now made clear. So we'll hope that the media sometimes comes clean. Thank you ever so much, Professor Talhami. This has been a very important analysis, and I'm sure our audience will appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.